Years ago, I went to North Korea and I spent a little bit of time there trying to understand as much as I could about real life propaganda in action. And when I came back, I remember visiting the States afterwards, and someone came up to me and said, "Oh, what was North Korea like? It must have been crazy." And they said to me, "It must have been crazy given all the propaganda there." And I said, "Well, there's really one main difference between North Korea and the States." And they said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, in North Korea, there's one point of view. In the States, there's 2 points of view." And obviously, I'm being a little bit glib there in the sense of obviously there's lots more nuance. People are a lot more informed in the States. But fundamentally, we keep coming down to a sort of a simplifying it into one way of thinking. And so with inner propaganda, we build beliefs ourselves. I've sort of built a framework in terms of how we cultivate the beliefs that we do and why we believe what we believe. And it really speaks to not just the importance of the logical beliefs, but also the emotions and how emotions affect the beliefs that we build. And therefore, if we want to change beliefs, it's not enough to, as Adam Grant would say, to logic bully people. We need to be able to change the way people feel.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Have you ever wondered how someone who seems intelligent could end up in a cult? For that matter, have you even wondered what a cult is, and if somebody was in one, would they recognize it? What kind of propaganda does it take? And who is so effective at spreading and enabling that propaganda that you can get people, smart people like you and I, to do things that they might see as even contradictory to their nature? That's where we're going. The Dov Baron Show, where curiosity meets profound insights. Tap into our community of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. This isn't just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features global wisdom of leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. Today, we are decoding the psychology of influence and belief systems with Owen Fitzpatrick, a world-renowned expert on the hidden dynamics of cults and the art of persuasion. If you've ever been baffled by the power of religious, political, or social cults to transform rational individuals into fervent followers, this is where you need to be. It's a riveting 2-part series with Owen Fitzpatrick, and we're going to unravel the complex web of emotional manipulation, strategic persuasion that can lead to even the most intelligent among us into ideological captivity. We're strapping on the tanks and taking a deep dive into the psychology of influence with our expert on cult dynamics and persuasion. Owen Fitzpatrick is going to dissect the emotional manipulation and strategic persuasion at play. Owen is a world-renowned psychologist, author, and storyteller who has been engaged by some of the global giants like Google, Coca-Cola, etc. He's coached billionaires, Olympic athletes, and studied with institutions like Harvard and MIT. His viral TEDx talk, Mind Control, and his books on behavioral science have reached millions globally. Join us for this thought-provoking journey into the belief systems that transform our actions, our societies, so that you can arm yourself and safeguard yourself against those who would have undue influence. With that, ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome author, speaker, coach, and superstar, Mr. Owen Fitzpatrick. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Dov. Pleasure.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I loved our last conversation. I know we've got a lot of common friends, but there was a certain magic in our last conversation that was, oh yeah, we're going to really get into some meaty stuff here. So that's great. But I always like to start the show with the emotional source code of an individual. Nobody arrives at where they are without a journey. And oftentimes that journey is catalyzed by something from our past that could be profoundly insightful, could be traumatic, could be a great blessing. You and I, one of the things we have in common is we're both polymaths. We both like to study all kinds of weird and wonderful things and find a way to bring them together. I think you've done a better job of honing it in than I have, but nonetheless, where does all that start for you?
I think with risk of being cliched, the most important influence on me was when I was a teenager, when I was 13 or 14 or so. I was severely depressed. So I reached a point in my childhood or my adolescence where I was pretty alone. I didn't have many friends. I was a very deep thinker. I was very empathic. So I was very much in terms of feelings and in touch with feelings, and very philosophical. And so I was suicidal for a while and I considered ending my life. I was very close a couple of times. And it all kind of happened when I drafted one of the many suicide letters. And this was the one where everything changed for me. I drafted a suicide letter where I was explaining to my parents why I had to end my life. And during that, I found myself engaging in a sort of a debate back and forth with myself. And then what was going to be a short letter turned into a 4 or 5 pager. And that became the catalyst for me being fascinated with, obviously, spoiler alert, I ended up changing direction, but it became the catalyst for me to be fascinated about beliefs. That letter wasn't the turning point which made me happy after that. I still struggled, but it was something that brought me on to a different journey. And from there on in, I became absolutely fascinated with psychology, particularly why do we believe what we believe? How do we change those beliefs? Why did my belief change then? What was the reason why I was able to talk myself out of it? And who was talking who out of what? Like all of that, it was something I was diving into. So that was really probably the most important moment if I think back to what made a huge difference to my life.
With retrospect, are you aware of why you were depressed at 13 or 14? I also understand that adolescents go through that as a phase, but that deep sense, and for you, the sense that you were going to end it multiple times, do you have a sense of what it was that was driving that depression for you?
I think there's a few factors. I think fundamentally I have a very close relationship with my family. So I don't think it was necessarily family related, like so many people struggle with that in their life. For me, I think my general way of thinking has always been quite dark. I'm quite in touch with the dark side of the world and reality. I'm very sort of a deep thinker. And I don't mean deep in terms of necessarily always intelligent, right? But I'm deep in that I think a lot about life. And I think it's a sort of a natural predilection for people who think a lot and they tend to focus on that to sometimes have that moving into depression. There's a concept that I think we both discussed before, the concept of the default mode network. And this is a network in the brain which is activated whenever we're thinking about ourselves and telling ourselves stories about ourselves. And typically in people that struggle with depression, a lot of times it's the activation of this particular network, which happens to us all whenever our minds are wandering. But more often than not, I found myself engaging in constant stories about who I was. And so as a teenager, I was quite socially awkward. I was quite sort of unaware of what's going on around me sometimes, a bit clumsy still. I'm clumsy still, a bit of a klutz. But some of those factors, whereas now it's like, well, it doesn't matter. You kind of grow out of it. Nowadays, looking back on it, as a teenager, these are things that negatively impact your social status. And back then, or your social status, that's everything to you as a teenager. So for me, I think it was a combination of those different factors that led me down the road to struggle. I got bullied a lot, physically as well as emotionally. And I found the emotional bullying was worse than the physical bullying because, again, it was down to how I saw myself.
So were you bullied because you were a deep thinker? Because I know that's what I experienced. I've got a good sense of humor and I'm very playful and I can be sort of quite glib. But at the same time, I'm also very deep. And as a kid, being deep was like, I might as well just smell of skunk. It was just like repels people.
I think for me, it was probably just because I was weird, right? That was a word. The word reject came in mind. The word weird. Reject was like the loose term for anyone who wasn't cool or popular. And I was never going to be because I was kind of, like I said, a bit awkward and social, but I was weird. I don't know how many people would have known that I was deeper per se, but I think I just came across different to most people. And maybe some of that was in my head, but certainly I was definitely picked out. And I noticed other people might have been bullied, but it almost like it didn't seem to affect them the same way.
Right.
Because it was almost like sometimes you're not aware of what people are doing. Like a lot of times the bullying manifested in a certain look by a person, whereas you might miss that. I read everything. Like the one thing I was good at since I was very young is reading people and knowing the subtext of the conversation. So you could say something to another person about me and I would be able to read like the subtle digs. So I was extra aware of all those. And I think that also made it harder from that perspective for me to deal with it.
And that for me is very interesting because that hypervigilance that you're describing, that hyper awareness, one of my sort of central philosophies is that the curse is a blessing and the blessing is a curse. That if you're born into wealth, people will look at you and go, wow, you're so blessed. It's so great that you got that. But they have no idea what the curse might be of that situation. And you and I both know, because we've dealt with those kinds of people, that oftentimes it's an enormous curse. And this hyper-vigilant awareness of being able to read people is a horrible curse. I lived with it as a child too. And it was like, am I paranoid or am I actually working out that people are just thinking or saying shitty things about me?
Yeah.
And then realizing now in my life that this is one of my greatest gifts. Is that how it is for you?
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to describe it. I think for me, it is. It's exactly what you said. It's my greatest weaknesses are my greatest strengths. Even the polymath thing, right? Which I know it's a big factor for you. The polymath thing is a huge advantage. It's wonderful. It's amazing. It allows you to be able to bring different things together and solve problems in ways. And it's a massive advantage from a creativity perspective and from an insight perspective. It's wonderful. But try talking to a marketing consultant about your need to niche down and to find your niche. Like, it's so difficult to do because it's like in screenwriting. I do a bit of screenwriting, and one of the phrases they say is, look, if you've got a scene that you love and the dialogue's tight and it's funny and it's brilliant, but if it doesn't serve the narrative of the story, you got to kill it. And this is known as killing the babies or killing the darlings. And so from my perspective, that's the thing. It's like, with this like wide variety of creativity, it's amazing. But at the same time, it has the disadvantage of making it harder to focus in and niche down as well.
Yeah. And I wonder how many of our viewers and listeners are in that place that you and I have been in, because we live in this niched world. And I honestly believe in the age of AI that this is the rise of the generalist. It's going to be the rise of the polymath, because if you're a specialist, AI can take your job at any second, because no matter how specialized you are, it's going to be more specialized than you because it's gathering information at an insane level. But being able to tie things together the way that a generalist or a polymath can is something else altogether. It's just my prediction. I think that we're coming into that time.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a big part of your ability to succeed moving forward will be the ability to generalize and look at how everything fits together, for sure. I think that on the flip side, the ability to communicate effectively with AI really requires specificity as a sort of a skill set. So when you're prompting, for example, the problem with a lot of the AI content is it's so general. It's not great in information. But if you have the ability to be specific in the way in which you interact with it, that will get the best response from the AI. And then your generalist skills, as you pointed out, are able to put that together and to be able to see how everything works and how everything fits, and therefore help you to see new things that the AI on its own couldn't see.
You know, in the intro to the show, I talked about propaganda and talked about cults. One of the questions I asked at the beginning was, who is the most effective person at spreading propaganda? And your story about feeling suicidal at 13 or 14 and then talking yourself out of it somehow seems to me like a great illustration of internal propaganda that we take from somewhere, we put inside our own heads, and then we feed ourselves in either direction, because you talked yourself into feeling deeply and possibly going through the act of suicide and taking yourself out through that to becoming this world leader at understanding influence. Talk to us about that. Talk to us about internal propaganda.
So it's interesting. So I'm working on a book at the moment, and the title is Inner Propaganda. So it's very much about the way in which we persuade ourselves. And it's based on the notion that we have this idea with propaganda that it's almost like we're all brainwashed. So you're going along at life, and all of a sudden, the leaders or the powers that be decide to use propaganda to dictate how you think and how you feel and how you behave. And it's very quick we are to be able to get rid of our agency and sort of assume that we're all going to be manipulated like this. And at the same time, we also think, I suppose, arrogantly, that we're never going to be susceptible, but other people are. So it's like in the political discourse we have for example, in the States at the moment, you have people on both, and again, we're going to talk about both sides, but people on both sides thinking that the other side is the victim of propaganda.
Yes.
And the reality is that both are. And just to give you a little example of this, years ago, I went to North Korea, and I spent a little bit of time there trying to understand as much as I could about real life propaganda in action. And when I came back, I remember visiting the States afterwards, and someone came up to me and said, "Oh, what was North Korea like? It must have been crazy." And they said to me, "It must have been crazy given all the propaganda there." And I said, "Well, there's really one main difference between North Korea and the States." And they said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, in North Korea, there's one point of view. In the States, there's 2 points of view. And obviously, I'm being a little bit glib there in the sense of obviously there's lots more nuance. People are a lot more informed in the States. But fundamentally, we keep coming down to a sort of simplifying it into one way of thinking. And so with inner propaganda, we build beliefs ourselves. I've sort of built a framework in terms of how we cultivate the beliefs that we do and why we believe what we believe. And it really speaks to not just the importance of the logical beliefs, but also the emotions and how emotions affect the beliefs that we build. And therefore, if we want to change beliefs, it's not enough to, as Adam Grant would say, to logic bully people. We need to be able to change the way people feel. And in order for us to do that, we need to understand fundamentally what is the way in which we're propagandizing ourselves. How are we convincing ourselves to believe in a certain political figure or a political way of thinking? How are we convincing ourselves that we're not good enough? How are we convincing ourselves, like I did many years ago, that I didn't deserve to live and that I'd be better off dead? We convince ourselves with these. The stories we sell ourselves, not just tell ourselves, the stories we sell ourselves are the beliefs that we buy into. And so for me, that's how I see the world, is that it's not just people are persuading us, we're persuading ourselves based on our biases, based on our emotions, based upon an emotional source code, based upon an infinite array of different areas. And what I try to do is help people unpack that. So as leaders, as individuals, as different performers in different areas, how can people start to make it so they overcome or redirect their own inner propaganda so they can perform better, become happier, more relaxed, more confident, and so that they can be better at being critical thinkers, thinking and making better decisions as a result.
Well, you and I talked about last time that the challenge is that people say they want to change. And to a degree, I believe them. I believe that they believe they want to change. But that's not the same as actually wanting to change. How is this work that you're talking about helping leaders? Because you and I both know, we've talked about this before, we're both friends of Richard Bendler. You are a close associate of Richard and written books with him. And as Bendler says, the problem is not getting people in a trance, it's getting people out of a trance that they're already in. And we both know that on the surface, I've done change work with people, belief change work with people, and it's ineffective. It's not totally ineffective, but it doesn't last because the belief on its own is not enough as well. So walk us through, why would somebody bring you in to work with you? And what is the mechanism that you walk them through that's different or that's taking them in a way that will have it stick versus what just doesn't stick?
So first of all, whenever I am hired to work with, let's say, an organization, a large part of it comes down to them fundamentally trying to change some form of belief. Now, this could be believing in yourself as a leader. It could be believing in the organization. It could be people, a team, believing in each other to work more effectively together. Or it could be even convincing your customers or clients to believe more in the messages that you communicate. And so to me, one of the important elements that I suppose I bring to the table that's a little different is because I've spent so long studying brainwashing propaganda and looking how sometimes for nefarious reasons, people can influence in a very successful way and actually lead to successful behavior change. I've always been looking at what are the missing pieces. And as you well know, Dov, most people try to change beliefs purely with logic. What they'll do is they'll give you all the reasons in the world why something's not true. And something that's much better than doing that is what myself and yourself have both been trained in, which is similar to Socratic questioning. It's the meta model, as known in NLP, or it's in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's challenging cognitive distortions. Fundamentally, it's about asking questions to get people to start to doubt the beliefs that they hold on to. And so that definitely is significantly more powerful than just trying to give them evidence as to why they're wrong. But the missing pieces for me, there's a number of them that I walk through, and it's based upon a framework that I built called the scaled framework of belief change. And each of the letters, it's an acronym that stands for stories, communities, actions, logical reasoning, emotional reasoning, and driver desire. So just to walk through them quickly and briefly. Stories are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves about the world. So fundamentally, as a therapist for years, I work with clients that would come in and the reason for their problems was twofold. Either A, the reason for their problems was everybody else, or B, the reason for their problems was themselves. So in other words, they were a victim of the world or they were a villain in their own world. And the job of a great therapist or change work or change agent or coach was to help them to take charge, become the heroes of their own stories so that they could then make new choices. So they had to first focus on the agency and the control they could have over their life. And then they had to make new choices as a result so they could become the heroes, because all heroes start as either villains or victims. And then they make the transformation by recognizing the power they have. So the stories we tell ourselves become the beliefs that we buy into. And it's not just the stories we tell ourselves, it's that we sell ourselves these stories, because we always have, whenever something happens, we can make a decision to go, okay, the reason I got rejected was because they don't know what they're missing out on, or the reason I'm rejected is because I'm not enough, or the reason I'm rejected is because I'll always be alone. So the story we decide to buy into as a result of that stimulus becomes the very story we live our life by. And then everything becomes a filter to that. The second element is community or culture. And this is one that for many years, although I knew the importance of it, it's only the last 6 or 7 years and the polarization in the States that's really helped me to understand the true power of this. And this is community and culture. And this is really that the people you surround yourself with will play a large part in determining the beliefs that you have. So it's almost like they reinforce the beliefs. Sometimes they'll feed the beliefs to you, but they'll reinforce the beliefs and you become a lot more convinced. And it's the same in terms of these echo chambers online. You go online, Facebook steers you to more of the same conspiracies or more of the same facts that you're used to. Before you know it, you're completely believing in one way of thinking and everyone else is wrong and you and your gang are right. So that's a big piece as well. Then there's actions, and these are habits. And this is based upon a concept called self-perception theory in terms of literature. In a nutshell, it's the reason why people are often able to change habits, or why people fall back on change, is that we often look to the actions we engage in or the habits we have to determine who we are.
Yes.
And so James Clear talks about in his book, Atomic Habits, which I'm sure most of the listeners and viewers will have seen, would be every time you engage in a behavior, it's a vote for the person you become. And so this conflict that occurs whenever we're acting in a different way to who we believe we are is known as cognitive dissonance. And this tension between who we believe we are versus how we're acting forces us to either change how we see ourselves or change the behaviors we engage in. In other words, our beliefs about ourselves are often influenced by what we actually do. So we need to make a change in terms of not just the community we surround ourselves with, but the actions we take, as well as the stories that we recognize or we're aware of that we're telling. And then the final three pieces are logic. This is the one we're both experts at. Everybody listening is probably an expert at this. This is our ability to rationalize. And whereas most people see logic as being, I figure out what's actually going on by logically evaluating what's occurring, actually logic works better as our ability to rationalize. Logic is more like a lawyer or an attorney that's job it is to prove whatever we want to prove. So our logic is used to rationalize, not to be rational. And so we can convince ourselves of almost anything. And that's why whenever someone tries to attack you or tries to convince you with logic, you have what we call confirmation bias. You look for evidence to prove that you're right, and you dismiss evidence that contradicts it. So logic, while it's useful, it's not enough to change minds. Then we get to one of the areas that you're known for, Dov, particularly, but the emotional reasoning. And emotional reasoning is, there's a concept in neuroscience called affective realism, which means the way you feel physically affects how you see the world. And so you can create and form beliefs just because you felt a certain way when you experienced a certain event. If you felt a different way, if you weren't as, let's say, inverted commas, hangry, which is angry when you're hungry, or tangry, angry when you're tired, or you weren't anxious at the time, you might have built an entirely different belief. But you cultivate a lot of the beliefs that we build whenever we feel a certain way. And that could be our emotional source code from the huge events, but it could be smaller beliefs that happen on a regular basis all the way through our lives, which, as you would have said, can definitely influence us too. And then finally, it's the last piece, the driver desire. We believe fundamentally what we want to. There was a fascinating study done a few years ago where they looked at all the variables to try to evaluate what makes people believe what they do. And the thing that had like an 80 to 90% success rate determining what people will believe is people will believe whatever they want to believe. There's one element that you mentioned at the beginning, which is, why do people say they want to change and they don't? I think they do want to change, but they want to stay the same more. And I think it's a competing of both of those two wants, because people might say, well, how can you say that? I don't want to believe that I'm useless. But there's a part of you that gets something from that, and you want to believe it in one sense, And so it's not a simple case of us only wanting the positive. Sometimes there's a part of us that wants the negative because in some twisted way, it actually makes us feel better about ourselves.
Human beings don't do anything without a payoff. So what that means is that if you're doing something shitty, and hey, I do and have done plenty of shitty things, even though I don't consider myself to be a shitty human being, there's some payoff in that, some emotional payoff. And sometimes the payoff, as I always tell my clients, sometimes the payoff is the validation of a shitty belief. So if I believe this shitty belief, then I'm closer to my mom or my dad when I was a kid, or I'm closer to my sibling or whatever it is. There's some payoff that makes it valid that at that moment is more important than what it is that I'm trying to change. So there's so many factors that I think that people don't understand. And that really takes us into this other piece, because you've been talking about this division that we're seeing in the United States particularly, but it's certainly happening in the United Kingdom, it's happening in France, it's happening in Germany, it's happening even in Australia, countries that we're both very familiar with. But we also see it in places like Hungary and other places. And that is this political division that's coming about. And one of the things that I've found very interesting lately, and we'll probably get more into it in the second part of the show, but one of the things I found very interesting lately is how people who were absolutely against are suddenly switching sides. That's very unusual. So there are people who were like very anti-Trump who are now like, yeah, I voted for Trump. I'm like, what? Really? You? And on the other side are people who are like fervent. Trump's going to be the greatest. Is what we need. So it's really interesting to see this dynamic shift. What's your thoughts on that? You and I have talked a lot about how beliefs are attached to identity. And identity is very difficult to give up. And so when there's a dramatic shift, like I'm anti-Trump to I'm pro-Trump, or I'm pro-Trump to I'm anti-Trump, that for me is where I go, ooh, this is delicious. This is very interesting. What's your thoughts on that?
I think a big part of it comes down to the Wizard of Oz phenomenon. Once you peel behind the curtain and you realize that there's a man, sorry, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the Wizard of Oz, but once you peel behind the curtain and you see that there's a man controlling this, all of a sudden that counterexample breaks every single belief you have. So I think the way I would explain it again, look, with everything to do with Donald Trump or the Democrats or the Republicans or whatever, it's multifactorial. There's a number of reasons why. It's like when people like to turn around and go, oh, the reason the Democrats lost was A. Well, it wasn't just A. There was a number of different reasons. But fundamentally, one of the bigger reasons from my perspective is that you have people, let's say, that believe Trump is the greatest thing in the world. And then they reach a certain situation where two things happen. First of all, the story they've been telling themselves comes up against a sort of a break whereby they can no longer integrate the reality they're experiencing into the narrative that they've been telling themselves. So therefore, they eventually realize, oh, this was this lie. And they instantly recalibrate and change the story they're telling themselves. Same is true on the other side. Whenever you hated Trump but thought he was the worst, and now all of a sudden you vote for him, it's once again, you might have told yourself the story that for years I've been listening to the Democrats telling me the way it is. They're very educated and this and that. And you have a story that says Trump is the crazy person and the Democrats are like this. And then you listen to podcasts or you watch what some of the speeches do and you start to see what the other side, inverted commas, have been saying. And you then fall into their story and you go, actually, that story makes a lot of sense. These things have been frustrating me. And this whole story doesn't fit up. And this makes a lot more sense. So to a degree, we buy into a new story. And then the second reason I think is to do with identity, like you mentioned, Dov. It's like, who do I want to be? I think there was interesting research out there which showed that people that tended to be more rebellious a few years ago were more like on the Democrat side. And now the people that are more rebellious tend to be more on the Republican side. Both sides at the extremes, they ban books. Both sides at the extremes, they've like very strong anger. They've a lot more in common, I think, the extremes with each other than they do with most of the people in the middle or middle left or middle right. But fundamentally, that's what garners attention. So why does a conspiracy take off? Why do people believe in things? We believe in things because it kind of makes sense and it kind of gives us an explanation to something that we've never been privy to, but it also gives us an identity that we are in the know. I'll bring one more point in because I think this is also critical. If you look at Tulsi Gabbard, if you look at RFK Jr., if you look at that transition, or even Liz Cheney on the other side, it's fascinating to watch. And I know that lots of people will disagree whenever we say this. When Tulsi and RFK went over to, let's say, to the right, they were welcomed in with open arms. People were delighted. People treated them so well. It was like, wonderful. This is someone who's now on our side. They've seen the light. And the same with Liz Cheney. She's seen the light. And when we have people like that, at the same time, you got people, let's say, on the left for Tulsi and RFK, and they're like, you're disgusting. I can't believe that you don't buy into our thing anymore. How dare you? Same with Liz Cheney. As soon as you start to doubt that the wizard is there, you get kicked out before you get a chance. You see the wizard and you start to question it. Socrates had the same thing more than 2,000 years ago. As soon as you start to question, all of a sudden you become enemy of the people, and it's the people that you were friends with beforehand. And then the other people, the other side, will embrace you. And I think that's also a huge part to play as well.
And just to sort of sew this up before we end up this part of the show, that is really such a great bookend to what I talked about at the beginning. That piece you just described there is the foundation of cult. The foundation of cult is they, your family, your whoever, have rejected you. We will accept you. But if you speak a word against us, the cult, we will reject you. It's exactly the same. This is why I've said that politics has become cult. It's nothing more. And before we go any further, just to say, what I want to have everybody stop and think about is this. Are you in a cult? Now, you will automatically probably say, of course not. But really think about what it means to be in a cult, where you're absolutely accepted unless you speak out against the cult. Let me give you one simple example before we end part one. Is your family a cult? Are you allowed to speak out against the family, to the family? How many of us Brits, have stood in a pub talking about our sibling as being the X or Y, something negative, and then somebody else says something about your brother and you want to punch him in the nose? And he's saying exactly what you said. You're allowed to speak in the cult, but not out of the cult.
What's interesting as well, though, is, and we've, similar to you, in Ireland, we've a similar response in terms of we can talk, and we've kind of, like in Britain, what you guys would experience would be you're able to have banter and have a bit of a laugh with each other and like almost insult each other to each other's faces and stuff like that. But at the same time, very protective and defensive. One of the interesting things I've noticed certainly about Ireland, and I don't know if it's true in terms of Britain, but a difference with Irish politics, because I was home for the Irish election recently and I was in America for the American election. We could talk about politics in Ireland quite comfortably, right? And there's no real problem. We can disagree about politics and it might get a little like louder voices, but we're able to do it. I feel it's a lot harder to do it in the States. I feel that the polarization that's occurred here, certainly in terms of my experiences, makes it a lot harder to have these conversations. And when you don't have those conversations, similar to a cult, if you can't talk about it, you can't discuss it, then you're left to your own devices. And then you're left to what they call love bombing, which is when the cult is super nice to you and super wonderful. It makes you feel lovely. You're left to that to then gradually, bit by bit, start to find yourself moving more and more. And I just think that's a really important fact, is one of the biggest things that cults do that now exists in the political dynamics as well is let's not talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it, then all we're going to do is continue to fall into the echo chambers and continue to believe whatever train we're already on. And before you know it, we just see the other side as a different species.
And in part two, let's talk about how we can talk about it and how we have to break the grip of the cult that we have unconsciously or consciously led ourselves into. We're going to be back for more of our delicious conversation with Owen Fitzpatrick in just one click. But before we go, Owen, please tell people where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources.
Sure. So if anyone's interested, I'm on all the social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and whatnot. I've got a YouTube channel. My podcast is Changing Minds. So if you look me up, Owen Fitzpatrick, I have a YouTube channel, owenfitzpatrick.com as well. And I have a newsletter, lastly, which is owenfitzpatrick.com/newsletter. It's called Inner Propaganda. Every week I send out an article and some tips and strategies and what I call brain prompts to help you to hopefully take more control over the way in which you influence yourselves and others.
We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Owen Fitzpatrick. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.